Okay, so for this practical, we're going to have a look at altitude training and how effective that is. So in the lectures, we've already discussed the various different types of altitude training. So we've got live high, train high, whereby you would live and train at terrestrial altitude. We've got live high, train low, where you'd spend a period of time typically sleeping at altitude, but returning to sea level to do your training or near sea level. And we've got live low, train high. Now, those first two methods, whilst there's been a lot of research done on them, and the evidence is pretty clear that they do improve oxygen carrying capacity, the results are firstly rather transient, and upon return to sea level, we only tend to benefit for about 2 weeks from any hematological changes that we see within the body. So increases in red blood cell count, oxygen capacity, and an increase in plasma volume. The other issue with those methods is they're not particularly practical, because typically we have to go and live at altitude for around 30 days, 28 to 30 days, before returning to sea level. So there's also a cost implication involved with that. So one thing that we're going to do over the next couple of weeks is have a look at an alternative method, which is the live low, train high. So this method uses a hypoxic simulator. So when we go to terrestrial elevations, that's what's termed hyperbaric hypoxia. So whilst the oxygen concentration in the air as we ascend up a mountain doesn't change, and that doesn't change pretty much until we get up into the stratosphere, the barometric pressure does change, okay, and that's what makes it harder to breathe, because there's a reduction in that oxygen cascade, okay, that pressure gradient, so we can't drive air into the lungs as effectively. With hypoxic generators that we're going to be using over the next couple of weeks, that's termed normobaric hypoxia, because this time the pressure remains constant because we're not going anywhere, we're doing this at sea level, but the systems have a series of filters that scrub off a certain amount of oxygen, and that gets then fed through to the face mask. So over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to take part in a couple of tests. So we're going to start by doing two 20-minute maximal effort tests. So these are what's termed functional threshold power tests. And at the end of that, we're going to get our average power output, average heart rate. We're also going to take oxygen saturation and hemoglobin levels as well. And as I say, I'm going to do that twice. First, I'm going to do that at a simulated altitude of 2,500 meters. And I'm then going to do that again the following day at an altitude of, sea level. Okay, so without the simulated altitude. I'm then going to embark on a 4-week training plan. And that's going to be a combination of very short HIIT type activities, all on a cycle ergometer. So that'll be 3 times a week, and it'll involve some very short HIIT sessions, so 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, and it'll also include some longer sessions, so some more consistent 5, 10, 20-minute efforts as well. At the end of that 4-week period, I'm going to repeat those 2 same baseline FTP tests, and hopefully we'll see whether there's a difference in performance. Okay, so we're just going to put the mask on now. We'll turn the hypoxicator on, just let these 2 little reservoirs, so they collect air, so there's always something to breathe. We'll just let them inflate, and we'll put the mask on, and then we'll go into 20-minute maximum effort. Okay, so I've started the test now, so a 20-minute maximal effort at a simulated altitude of 2,500 metres. So it's quite difficult to see from the screen, but oxygen saturation is about 98% to start with, and by around 5 minutes that's dropped to about 91–92%. We can also see from the video that the two green reservoirs are still well inflated during this early stage of the test, so that's indicating that I'm not breathing overly heavily at this stage, and my pedalling is reasonably easy.
Straight away, I can feel how much harder it is. I'm really struggling. Not a good idea.
Skipping forward to the end of the test, as I'm sure you don't want to watch me suffering for a full 20 minutes. But if we look now at those two green reservoirs, you can see that they're pretty much fully deflated. Okay, so that's showing that I'm breathing very, very heavily, and my oxygen saturations at this point had actually dropped down to 81%. Okay, now as a university we have an ethical cut-off point of 80% oxygen saturation, so I was getting very, very close to that. I'm going to let you listen to the last couple of minutes of the test, because you'll be able to clearly hear just how laboured my breathing is, and you can see just how much I'm rocking on the bike there compared to the start of the bike, because I'm finding it extremely difficult just to keep the pedals turning.
Straight away, I can feel how much harder it is. I'm really struggling. Not a good idea.
Skipping forward to the end of the test, as I'm sure you don't want to watch me suffering for a full 20 minutes. But if we look now at those two green reservoirs, you can see that they're pretty much fully deflated. Okay, so that's showing that I'm breathing very, very heavily, and my oxygen saturations at this point had actually dropped down to 81%. Okay, now as a university we have an ethical cut-off point of 80% oxygen saturation, so I was getting very, very close to that. I'm going to let you listen to the last couple of minutes of the test, because you'll be able to clearly hear just how laboured my breathing is, and you can see just how much I'm rocking on the bike there compared to the start of the bike, because I'm finding it extremely difficult just to keep the pedals turning. Okay, so that's our baseline test done. So yesterday we did a 20-minute functional threshold power test. It's a 20-minute maximal effort, and we did that at a simulated altitude of 2,500 meters. And the average power output for that ride was 192 watts. Okay, I've repeated the same test today, but without the altitude simulation, so we've done it at sea level. And today, my average power output over that same 20-minute period was 240 watts. So you can see it's quite a significant difference, okay? Nearly 50 watt difference. Now, that's just a little bit short of my PB, okay? So my PB is 249 watts for 20 minutes. That was done about 5 years ago, so I'm a little bit older. So over the course of this process, am I realistically going to expect to see new PBs at 46 years old? Probably not, but hopefully what we will see is an improvement in those power outputs. I'll get the heart rates and the blood lactates and everything, and I'll put all those on the at the end of the clip once I've done the training plan. But over the next 4 weeks, I'll be doing an altitude training program, and hopefully we'll see that my average power, heart rate, etc. during those 2 20-minute efforts, both at sea level and at altitude, will increase quite markedly. As I say, I'm not expecting to see new PBs, although that would be nice, but hopefully we'll see some improvements. So all there's left to do now is 4 weeks of training, and we'll see what happens at the end. Okay, so for the actual training plan, I'm going to follow one that's been developed by Sporting Edge. Now, normally this would be an 8-week training plan in an ideal world, but they do recommend that you can shorten it to a 4-week period if you're struggling for time. So given the duration that I've got to do this before your session, I'm going to do the 4-week block instead, which is comparable to the training plan that I did in my PhD that we discussed within the lecture. So within the 4-week block, and I'll put a copy of this on Microsoft Teams for you to have a good read through, but we're going to focus on weeks 1, 6, 7 and 8. So they take out the more high intensity HIIT type training. Now there is still some HIIT based work in these sessions, but the focus is more so on endurance training. So if we have a very quick look at those blocks, we can see we start off at a reasonably low altitude of around 2,000 meters, quite short sessions, so 10-minute warm-up and cool down, and some 2 minutes on, 1 minute off. There are some 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off sessions, as I said, so it's not all pure endurance. We go through to week 6, because we're cutting out the high intensity sprint elements, then we can see the sessions are getting slightly, Sessions are getting slightly longer, some 30-minute efforts, 4 minutes on, 10 minutes on, and so on. As well as this training plan, I'm going to be supplementing that with my normal training, which is generally 2 rides, 2 runs a week. And I tried to split that as 1 longer session and 1 shorter session. And equipment-wise, I've standardized everything, so I'm using the same bike throughout for all testing and all training, including outdoors riding as well. And I'm using the same static turbo trainer to mount the bike on to do these altitude sessions and the pre and post testing. Okay, so this is an example of just one of the training sessions that I did over 4 weeks. I think this was 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off. So if we have a look at the green reservoirs, you can see they're well inflated in a minute. This is a rest period, so I'm just lifting the face mask off just so I can get normox occurring, rather than keep taking it on and off, which takes up too much time. So I'm just pedaling nice and easy at the minute. Bags are well inflated, not breathing particularly hard. I know we've gone into a sprint session, so hard as I can, 30 seconds, and look how quickly those bags have drained, okay, starting to drain. So they're 3 litre bags each, there's 2 of them, so I'm draining almost 6 litres of air very rapidly, and you should be able to hear just how hard I'm breathing. Okay, so that's the end of that interval. So another 30 seconds now, just recovering. Look how quickly the bags start to reinflate as I've stopped exercising. I think I was just adjusting the altitude a little bit there because I think it had drifted a little bit from what it should have been. So again, just lifting the face mask off again, pedaling nice and easy, just trying to recover as much as I can in that 30 seconds before we go into the next effort. And off we go again. So again, look at the bags, just drifting out to side a little bit there. But we can see just how quickly they're starting to deflate again. Okay, I'm not going to show you any more of the training sessions because they're all pretty much the same. So we're now going to jump ahead and look at the results. Okay, so I've finished the block of testing and I've done all the pre and post functional threshold power tests. So a couple of things just to note before we get into the findings. In terms of the actual training duration, I've said during this video that it's been 4 weeks. For the best part of that, I managed to stick to the training plan as was prescribed. And there was only 2 sessions in the final week, which I didn't manage to do. So that kind of takes us pretty much into the same sort of training plan that I used for my PhD, as I mentioned before. So just over 3 weeks and 3 times per week. In terms of the oxygen saturation and the blood values, unfortunately, we didn't manage to get those again, primarily because with the oxygen monitor, sweat was just interfering too much and we couldn't get a nice clear signal. So aside from that, I think the training plan went pretty well. So did it work? Okay, well, if we have a look at altitude exposure first, so the green bars are pre-altitude training and the blue bars are post-altitude training. And these are the results for actually performing the 20-minute FTP test at altitude, so at the 2,500 meters. And if we look at heart rate first, we can see that pre-training plan, average heart rate was 142 beats per minute, and following the 4 weeks of altitude training, that actually dropped down to 136 beats per minute. So that represented a change of 4.2%. So in other words, whilst I was actually riding at altitude, I was finding it approximately 4.2% easier with respect to heart rate. Now, if we look at the cadence values, this time, pre-altitude plan average cadence was 72 revs per minute. And then post-altitude, that had actually increased by just short of 8% to 78 revs per minute. Now, if you think back to the earlier part of this video when I was actually doing the baseline testing at altitude, you could probably see just how hard I was finding it to turn the pedals, and I was actually pedaling reasonably slowly. But after that training plan, I found it much easier to turn the pedals. So that's represented by this quite a significant increase of as I say, 7.7%. I guess the most important result though is our power output. So before the training plan, I think I said earlier in the video, my average power output was 192 watts. That was the value that was on the Garmin computer. But when I actually downloaded it to Excel, it was very slightly different. It was actually 193 watts. Okay. Forward 4 weeks, and after the training plan, that had actually increased by 6.8%. Okay. So my average 20-minute power output over that test had gone from 193 watts up to 207 watts. So that's a very large increase over what is a very short period of time. Moving on to the sea level exposure tests. And again, if we start with heart rate, then we can see pre-altitude training, the average heart rate was 146 beats per minute. And then following the altitude training program, that had actually increased to 152 beats per minute. So there's a 4% increase in heart rate there. Cadence was the same for both tests. There was no difference at all. But again, more crucially, the power output went from an average of 241 watts pre-training up to 249 watts following the training program. So that represented a 3.3% increase in average power output over the 20-minute period. So I was able to work at a higher intensity and there was a slightly higher heart rate that accompanied that. So there we go. To answer our original question, does simulated altitude training work? Then clearly it does. In only a 4-week period, I was able to increase my functional threshold power output by nearly 3.5%. Now, if we think back to earlier in the video, I said my previous PB over a 20-minute effort was 249 watts, and that was done about 5 years ago. I wasn't expecting to get anywhere near that, but as it turns out, I actually equaled it. So I'm really happy with that. I mean, it would have been nice to have got slightly better, but I had no expectations of beating that. So to actually be able to match that, a value that was set several years ago when I was considerably fitter, I'm really pleased with that. Thinking back to the lecture that we did last week, I mentioned that when I did my PhD, the participants in that study who did a similar training plan, so 3 times a week for 3 weeks, they improved the power output by around 12%. So why was my power output during this block of training somewhat lower than that? Well, it could be down to the altitude that we used. In that previous study, I used an altitude of 3,048 meters, whereas in this study, the baseline testing was at 2,500 meters, and then the training plan itself varied anywhere between 2,000 meters and I think 2,500 meters at most. So it was slightly lower. So maybe the hypoxic stimulus wasn't great enough to lead to as bigger improvements. That said, remember this plan is supposed to be an 8-week training plan, but you can break it down into a shorter 4-week block. So had I done that for the full 8 weeks, then we may well have seen improvements of that magnitude. So Hopefully that gives you a little bit more insight into the benefits of simulated altitude training, the practicalities of it, and how you would go about introducing that into your training session. So in the seminar, I want you to start thinking and discussing some of the factors that may have affected the results that we've seen during this video. Thank you.